Welcome to the Digital Identity Digest, the audio companion to the blog at Spherical Cow Consulting. I'm Heather Flanagan, and every week I break down interesting topics in the field of digital identity, from credentials and standards to browser weirdness and policy twists. If you work with digital identity but don't have time to follow every specification or hype cycle, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Digital Identity Digest. Today, we're diving into the latest round of AI buzz, but from the standards world, specifically what happened at IETF 123 in Madrid, and how it ties into a much bigger, messier, and louder story, which is about the infrastructure needed to support AI. And let me say right up front that if you feel like there's just way too much going on in AI and in standards right now to keep track of, you are absolutely correct. One of the main goals in this episode is to give you a bit of a map, not of every working group or project or proposal, but of some of the most relevant conversations and efforts underway. The kind of work that may not make headlines, but it will absolutely shape the AI systems your team's going to build on or run into or be regulated by. So let's talk AI, especially agentic AI, because that one's particularly interesting. So first thing, the phrase agentic AI refers to AI systems that can take autonomous action. Think large language models integrated into cute little bots, more commonly known as agents, that can invoke APIs, make decisions, complete multi-step tasks, and interact across systems on behalf of a user, or sometimes on behalf of another agent. It's actually a big shift, and like most shifts in computing, it's not going to work unless the plumbing underneath it all is sound. And by plumbing, I mean identity, delegation, authentication, policy enforcement, all the things we expect modern systems to manage, but that get very complicated when you introduce autonomous software running on behalf of someone else at the scale we've been talking about. So, where is that plumbing being discussed? Some of it's happening in groups explicitly focused on AI. These are newer efforts, still defining their scope, sometimes flying a little close to the hype cycle sun. But a lot of the more mature, relevant work is still happening quietly in places that don't actually even mention AI in their charter. And if you're only tracking groups that say AI in big, bold letters, you're going to miss some of the pieces of work that really matter in your software stack. So, for an example of some pretty crucial work that isn't necessarily labeled as AI focused, and we'll start with delegation chaining. So, if you work with OAuth or authorization in general, you've probably seen this one floating around. There's a draft on identity chaining that defines a way to preserve identity and authorization across multiple trust domains. Because that's what, chaining is about. You're pulling together all these different authorization models and yet going from one context to another, to another, to another. And this isn't just mildly useful, it's absolutely essential for AI agents acting on behalf of a user across multiple systems. Think, for example, like a scheduling agent that books your flights, reserves a hotel, updates your calendar. Each action is crossing a different trust boundary. The work on delegation chaining started well before the AI buzz took off, but agentic AI has absolutely accelerated the urgency, and product teams are starting to realize that without this kind of delegation model, they're stuck kind of duct taping credentials to every interaction, and that's not scaling very well. Another example of some pretty crucial work out there that doesn't specifically talk about AI is Whimsy, and that's short for the Workload Identity in Multi-System Environments. That's a working group in the IETF, and it sounds pretty enterprisey because it is. This group is tackling how workloads like services, bots, APIs, and yes, AI agents can assert identity across environments. AI was never mentioned in its charter, but if you're building or integrating agentic AI systems, the Whimsy use cases are absolutely relevant. It's about establishing identity in runtime environments that aren't tied to a human session, and that's the world that the AI agents live in. So, in both these cases, the takeaway should be, just because the work doesn't say AI doesn't mean that it isn't applicable to AI. Of course, There are also groups with AI right in the name and charter, and let's go through a few of these at the IETF. First up is the AI Preferences Working Group, or AI Pref. This group is focused on creating a standard way for users, or systems acting on their behalf, to express preferences about how their data is used in AI context. Whether that's for training, inference, or deployment, the idea is to move beyond vague privacy policies and build actual technical mechanisms that allow someone to say, yes, this data can be used for this purpose, or no, keep this out of your model. It's a pretty necessary layer of nuance if you think about it, and one that product teams working on LLM features or personalization tools should be paying attention to. This is where future browser controls, platform APIs, and compliant hooks may emerge. Then we have, as another piece of work, the WebBot authentication, which is still in a birds of a feather format, also known as a BOF. This group started really as hallway conversations and has now matured into a real discussion about how bots, especially AI powered ones, should identify themselves when accessing websites built for humans. And the questions are pretty straightforward, though the incentives are still a little wonky. The questions are like, are bots allowed? If so, how should they authenticate? Can we distinguish between helpful agents and malicious scrapers? And who's accountable when something goes wrong? And for the incentive, why would a bot even self-identify? What's in it for them? This is kind of a classic example of AI forcing us to just re-examine some assumptions. I mean, these bots are coming and many are already here, and we really need better tools to deal with them rather than having a blanket user agent ban or just rate limiting hacks. Finally, the last one I want to mention that happened at the IETF meeting in Madrid is the AI agent protocol discussion. This is still informal and it was held as a side meeting at IETF 123. But it's trying to answer the big question, should the IETF standardize protocols for how AI agents discover each other, invoke services, and communicate? I mean, there's already projects and proposals floating around like the Model Context Protocol or MCP, and questions about how those protocols should handle trust, authentication, and authorization. Lots of work, not necessarily tied together very well. Now, it's worth noting here, and I've written about this before, that MCP itself is not a standard, but it's showing up a lot in real world pilots, especially in cloud and browser environments. For MCP to work securely, it will rely on standards like what's coming out in OAuth with delegation chaining and other delegation models. It's a kind of a classic case of layering. MCP may define what the agent can do, but OAuth and various identity specs define how it can do it safely. Of course, the IETF isn't the only place where this work is happening. In the W3C, for example, there's two community groups that are worth watching. One is the AI Agent Protocol Community Group, which is trying to build protocols for how agents identify each other, collaborate, and operate on the web. Think of it as like DNS and HTTP for autonomous agents, I suppose. And another one is the AI Knowledge Representation Community Group, which is focused on how we structure domain knowledge so that AI systems can reason about it and ideally explain themselves in the process. But wait, there's more. If you shift over to another open standards organization, the OpenID Foundation, you have the AI Identity Management Community Group. They're taking a little bit of a slower, more deliberative approach in that they're not even trying to develop protocols. That's actually explicitly out of their scope. But they are mapping use cases, identifying gaps, and watching the regulatory landscape closely so that they can report out on it in a paper. All of that's important, and a lot of this work may be driven by compliance needs as much as by technical opportunity. Okay, so I'm going to assume that not everybody listening is deeply embedded in tech. You may be deeply embedded in product. So if you're a product manager or an executive, you might wonder, well, great, but what should I do with this? So some practical information. If your team is building anything that touches AI, whether that's internal automation, customer-facing assistance, or just data ingestion, you need to start thinking about where delegation shows up. Can your users safely let an agent act on their behalf across systems? What identity should look like for your non-human actors. Are you relying on user credentials where you maybe shouldn't? What about consent? What does consent actually mean? Can you enforce user preferences at a technical level when you've got an agent involved? And last but not least, what is your compliance team watching? When the regulations hit, how far behind will your architecture be? You don't need to track every working group, but someone on your team should have a handle on where these conversations are happening and what's likely to impact your roadmap, especially around all of these questions that you need to be thinking about. So, maybe a few signals for you to watch out for as you see MCP or delegation models being adopted by major cloud or browser vendors. Think about what standards they're building on. There may be new authentication guidance coming out around bots or agents, and that doesn't exist now, but you're going to need it soon. And absolutely watch for just like an increased amount of chatter from compliance, policy, or your legal advisors about AI related access and content. To be clear, I mean, this post and this episode is not comprehensive. It's one slice of a sprawling, fast moving standard space, and no one can track it all, and we're all going to miss things. But if the right people are talking across the groups, and therefore if we can avoid duplicating work or missing critical steps, then maybe, just maybe, we can lay the groundwork for agentic AI systems that don't break the web and don't break your product strategy. So keep your eye on the standards, because whether or not your platform identifies as AI first, the infrastructure it relies on is being shaped right now. The links to everything I mentioned are in the original blog post. I hope you found it useful, and thank you for listening. And that's it for this week's episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If it helps make things a little clearer, or at least a little more interesting, share it with a friend or colleague, and connect with me on LinkedIn at HL Flanagan. And if you enjoyed the show, do be sure to subscribe and leave me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the written full post at sphericalcowconsulting.com. Now stay curious, stay engaged, and let's get these conversations going.